Hi everyone. So in the last class we talked about first civil war, what it meant to be a leader of the Muslim community after the Prophet Muhammad died, and how the first fitna or breakup of the community occurred. Just a little bit of overview. There's four guys, four men: Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali. Each of them were actually pretty close to the Prophet Muhammad. They're all connected by marriage. Ali is actually the son-in-law and cousin. All of them are also part of the Quraysh tribe, the tribe that was living and kind of running Mecca at that time. In later sources, they're called the Rashidun, but in this period, they're just called by the title Amir al-Mu'minin. They're the head of the community, but that role is a military role, not a religious role. They're not prophets. They're not continuing anything, and they're also not necessarily, let's say, defining what are the religious obligations of the believers. That is still in the community itself. Now, as I pointed out, long story short, a fight occurs between Ali, the fourth of those men, and the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, and another faction of Quraysh. Ali is actually abandoned by the Quraysh tribe, even though he's part of it. And there is the son, or let's say the relative of Uthman, the murdered caliph, sues him or starts a war over leadership of the Islamic polity. So, as I pointed out, Ali beats one faction. He beats the faction led by the former widow of Prophet Muhammad, Aisha. And then he sets out to fight Muawiyah. Muawiyah, though, sues for peace. He says, doesn't sue for peace. He sues for arbitration. Says, let's deal with arbitration first. But this didn't quite work out for them. Or at least it didn't work out for Ali. He had trouble mobilizing his troops afterwards. He already had the upper hand when he was going to face Muawiyah. He had more troops, better position, etc. And now that he'd kind of given up that advantage, his troops were obviously, to some degree, unwilling to then, a year later, rally back up, go out and fight Muawiyah again. In the meantime, though, he was killed by a Kharijite assassin. Who are the Kharijites? They're kind of the first major theological break with the Muslim community at this point, right? They're people who take the idea of being believers to the utmost extreme, to the point where other believers who are failing to live up to those standards, who are not being pious enough, who are not believing in God deeply enough, not praying, fasting, etc., and going to the extreme of monotheism, deserve to be killed. And so they attack Ali. They basically assassinate him after prayers. Many of them are killed in a battle afterwards, but a good amount survive, and they go off to East Arabia, in Yemen and Oman, where they kind of create their own little communities for many centuries. Now, as I said, after Ali dies, during this process of arbitration, which is ultimately inconclusive, Muawiyah takes control of the believer/Muslim community and the new empire. And this sets up a difference, right? We're already no longer in the space in which these men are being appointed in an ad hoc fashion, right? So Abu Bakr is a kind of elected by consensus or by a small group. Abu Bakr appoints Omar. Omar dies, and then there's a shura, a council that then elects Uthman. Uthman is murdered. There's another process that puts in Ali. But each of these are sort of ad hoc processes for choosing a leader, and none of these men are technically directly related to each other. Afterwards, Muawiyah starts a dynasty, right? So everyone who rules after Muawiyah is a descendant of Muawiyah in some ways, a male heir in some sense of that family. until the Umayyads get destroyed. And the Umayyads themselves are named after a kinsman called Umayyah. In that process of leadership, there's still a whole variety of different priorities going through the minds of Muslims, of believers, as to what makes a good leader, who deserves to run the community. And on one hand, it's up to questions of piety, so who's the most pious, who's praying and keeping up the core beliefs that Prophet Muhammad set out in the Quran, of being a believer that we talked about before, monotheism, fasting, prayer, and belief at the Day of Judgment, and supporting the community. Another question is also precedence. Precedence both in terms of who's most senior, but also, who was the first to convert to Islam, to join the believer movement. That ultimately it still was felt that the people who should rule are the ones that went to Muhammad first, not the ones that joined later when it was inevitable or just wanted to gain monetary rewards. Three, there was question of kinship. Some people would think, for example, that Ali, as the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, had a stronger claim to running the whole place. And therefore, his descendants also had a strong claim. And four is effectiveness, that ultimately, outside of these three, there's still a good idea of what it takes to be a leader, and the best generals and the best governors, etc., might not be the ones who are the most pious or the ones that are most closely connected to the Prophet Muhammad. So these are four contrasting and competing priorities. Now, we'll get back to this, just keeping in mind these four men, the first four leaders after the Prophet Muhammad, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali, are sometimes called the Rashidun, the four rightly guided leaders. But it's important to keep in mind that this idea is something of a later addition, something that came about 200 years afterwards, in the process of justifying and making sense of this period. Now, who is Muawiyah, the guy that took over and started the first dynasty? He founded this dynasty called the Umayyads, which I've misspelled here. It should be one M and two Ys. And again, it's a dynasty. It is a succession of male heirs. And he starts doing things that turn the Islamic empire into an actual empire, into a polity. And this is quite different from what was around in Arabia before. There was no state before in Arabia. The states were in Byzantine Middle East, and then in the Sasanian Iran and Iraq. And Arabia was basically left to run in tribes, and there was rule of law, etc., to some degree, but it was ultimately by the power of the tribes themselves, and who was under whose protection. So if you had, so it was very unorganized and informal. Now, Muawiyah did some other things here. First, he's the first guy to put his name on a coin, right? So he's already taking a different sense of leadership and kingship. He puts his name on this coin, which is basically the Sasanian coin. Here you have the Sasanian emperor and the sort of, I think, fire temple or two people here. Now, he doesn't actually put his name in Arabic. He puts the name in Persian, under the name of in Pahlavi script. So you could only read this if you knew Pahlavi script, which many people still did. And he puts here the Bismillah, so you know it's a Muslim or Arabic coin, but basically it's the same coin, but he's put his name on it. And we'll see later how the coins transform at different times. The other thing he did, he moves the capital away from Medina. Medina was basically too small, too removed, too incapable of being the capital of a great empire that now stretched quite far away, from, as we'll see, from Spain to essentially Uzbekistan. And that's because his troops and his power base was in Syria. He was already the governor of Syria. Damascus was a clear space, already a major center, and it was a good place to run an empire that was now stretching further away. Medina was just too far from the roads and the circuits of empire. And finally, as this place becomes more and more formalized, he's turning campaigns into more formal events. It's not just, an outflow of nomads. There's purposeful campaigns, there's plans, there's people set up to be governors very clearly. The finance formalized. It's not just groups going out raiding and taking the spoils and then maybe redistributing in different ways. It's a much more formal affair than before. There's even, as I pointed out, is like a role of people who are supposed to be paid a payroll, and that is given to all Arab soldiers involved in these campaigns, etc. Finally, he's also creating, royal estates. He's formalizing the affairs of the dynasty, and he's creating, specific revenue streams for him and his family. Remember, this is the expansion that was occurring before the rule of Muawiyah, so up until right before Ali, basically until what's today the coast of Libya, into parts of Iran and Afghanistan. But during the Umayyads, from 656 to 750, for 100 years, the Islamic Empire expands massively. And here we can say it's one Islamic empire because it just has one government, right? And that's centered in Damascus here, and it's stretching out all the way to Spain. There's battles and raids, even as you say, in Poitiers, Narbonne, all the way into here in Italy. But also, basically North Africa, and then very far into what's essentially Uzbekistan and Pakistan today, into the Caucasus quickly and stuff. Parts of it, they don't have full control of everywhere. This Caspian Sea area right here, very mountainous and very difficult to get into. Similarly, Ethiopia was a failed invasion. But here they're also encountering Buddhists and a variety of other people. Most of the groups here, though, are Christian. And this isn't really going to change. One last thing is that they're also on occasion attacking the Byzantines. Here you can see a relatively solid and set frontier between the Byzantines and the Islamic Empire. This will basically stay the same for the next 500 years. But there were campaigns to attack Constantinople, including one by Khalid bin Zayd, known as Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. From the title, he was an Ansar, he was a helper, one of the people from Medina who helped Muhammad. And he was the son of, I believe, of Zayd, one of the freedmen of the Prophet Muhammad. So he knew the Prophet. He had led a campaign in Istanbul against the Byzantines that failed. The siege didn't go anywhere. He apparently died outside the city walls. His tomb was miraculously refound by a saint after the Ottomans had conquered the city in 1453, so about 1,000 years later. But 900 years later, his tomb is refound and commemorated. And today you can go to Turkey and see a very big shrine there dedicated to him. Now, all of this is to say that the majority of the people in this area that the Muslims have conquered are still Christians. There are Zoroastrians, of course, in Iran, but in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, and in Spain, the majority of the inhabitants are formally Christian, even though they probably, might not even have a church to go to, etc. But the local population is predominantly Christian. There's some Jews and some Zoroastrians, some Buddhists. And these are the people that end up taking over the administration. So as Muawiyah and others are building up an empire, it's Christians like this Sergius bin Mansur, a Christian Arab, who's being his chief financial officer, who's running of the financial side. And this makes sense because the population is not converting. On one hand, it wasn't quite a space in which Christians are necessarily converting formally. Already they could be part of the believer movement without formally converting. And also, if they converted, they wouldn't be paying taxes, special taxes for non-Muslims, or non-believers, I guess. And therefore, there's a situation in which it was generally frowned upon to formally convert and become clients of Arab tribes. at this point, Muawiyah and the Umayyads are patronizing Christian sites. They're going to places like Golgotha and Gethsemane, the tomb of Mary. They're rebuilding baths and leaving Greek inscriptions. So Greek is still the language of government and the language of things. At the same time, Pahlavi Persian is the language on the coins. It's the language of government in Iran and Iraq. So they're still using that same people, the same groups, and just kind of slowly inserting themselves into it. And at the same time, Muawiyah is also marrying into Christian tribes, Arab tribes, making alliances with different Christians in these areas. So marrying into Syrian Arab Christian tribes like the Kalib and the Ghassan. Now, is this part of their ecumenicalism? That is part of the greater believer movement in which Christians and Jews are still part of this community? It's unclear. It could also be a general imperial vision that now that they're the head of an empire, they have to kind of include everyone in there and make these sorts of connections. Now, Muawiyah's reign lasts a relatively long time, but it comes to an end when he dies. At this point, there's still not quite yet a clear notion of dynastic succession. It's possible that Yazid, Muawiyah's son, could take over, but he's not the strongest candidate. There's two other people that emerge as contenders. One is Hussein bin Ali, the son of Ali. As we'll see, he will be killed. Later on, another guy named Ibn Abdallah ibn al-Zubayr. Ibn al-Zubayr means the son of Zubayr. Zubayr was a very famous companion of the Prophet Muhammad, who I believe died at the Battle of the Camel. There's other descendants of first leaders are also vying, but each of these guys has a power base. Yazid is in Syria, Hussein is in Kufa, Iraq, and Zubayr ibn al-Zubayr is in Medina. We're going to see how that plays out in the next section.